So this didn't happen the other day. I went to the bank, and I needed to get some cash out of the bank, and I went to the ATM. I do go to the ATM. The bank was open at the time, and I always said I would never go to the ATM when the bank was open so that the tellers could be employed, but sometimes you compromise on your values for convenience, maybe? So anyway, I got some money out of the ATM, and I got 5 $20 bills, and I looked at the $20 bills, so then I went into the bank, and I said to the teller, I said, "Excuse me, but I got somebody else's money." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, obviously that's not me on the front. This is Andrew Jackson, so it must be his money." She said, "Oh, no, sir. That's one of the former presidents of the United States. I assure you that that's your money." I said, "Then why isn't my picture on it?" She says, "Well, you don't actually own the money. You just get to use it as a courtesy of the U.S. government." I said, "Oh, okay." So like I said at the beginning, so this didn't happen. In case you missed that part. But you can imagine somebody not familiar with the concept of money having that kind of a disconnect, saying, "Wait a minute, this belongs to Andrew Jackson because it's got his picture on the front." But no, as we all know, the system that we have, this is actually, and it says all over it, this is actually the property of the United States of America, and because of the system of economics that we have, they will allow me to use it and us to use it as a means of exchange with one another, representative of actually value behind it, but only representative of it, right? So if for some reason, and this certainly has happened, our whole economy collapsed, it would be back in the day where the pastor got paid with chickens and eggs and milk and fresh baked apple pies and all that kind of stuff. Because we'd be going back to a barter system. And in some countries, this in fact has happened, not the barter system, but where the value of money had so decreased that it wasn't really worth much. And you know, even $20 goes up and down, up and down. It's representative of something else. That's why Andrew Jackson's picture is on it and not mine. I do have something with my picture on it, and that's my driver's license. And I figure if I ever get convicted of a crime, I can take this very same picture and use it for my mug shot. I like the way they were able to do that to save time and money. Now, I just got this license not too long ago. And like I said, this has my picture on it, so this is my license. It's my license to drive. And I can do whatever I want with this license in terms of driving. And if I get pulled over, I can just say, "Well, wait a minute, I have a license." So if I'm doing 100 miles an hour down Manville Road and a police officer pulls me over, I can say, "I'm sorry, but I have a license to drive. There's my picture on it. It's my license. And this gives me the right to drive any way I want." And the police officer will quickly correct my misinterpretation of what it means to have a license, and will no doubt inform me that I am given this license by New York State, and by accepting this license, I also accept certain restrictions that go along with it, like not driving 100 miles an hour down Manville Road. So the image on it does not give me the right to do anything I want with this license. It implies certain responsibilities and obligations and commitments on the part of New York State and on my part. So much for images, right, sisters and brothers? Let's catch up with one another, shall we? Because I think in order to understand what's going on in Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees and the Herodians, we need to do a little bit of background and see where we've come so far to figure out where we are. And that means taking a quick look back at the readings that we've had over the past few weeks to determine where this conversation between Jesus and those in authority is going. As we noted last week, that conflict is getting more and more intense. We started out with a simple parable that you may remember that Bill Bellow preached on about a man who had 2 sons, and he asked them to go into the field and work, and one said yes and then didn't go, and one said no and then he went, and there was embarrassment there on the part of those who should have gone when they said yes. Then we heard the parable of the tenants in the vineyard who refused to give the landowner what was owed him. In fact, killed his servants, killed his son, and had the misconception that somehow if they did that, they would own the vineyard. And Jesus asks them the question, what do you think the landowner will do to those tenants? And they respond of their own free will and understanding, he will put them to a miserable death and give the vineyard to other tenants who will give him what is owed to him. Then last week we heard the parable again of the wedding feast and those who were invited, who refused the invitation. And when the servants come to reiterate the invitation with them, those servants too are put to death. And Jesus doesn't even ask the question, what will the king do to those who are invited to the wedding banquet? He answers it for them. He will put them to death and burn their city and invite others to the banquet. So you can see that over the course of these confrontations between Jesus and those in authority, the tension is getting worse and worse. The confrontation is getting stronger and stronger. And what I realized as I looked back and forward over these readings that we have over these weeks is that all of this happens in one day. In one day, as Jesus is walking in the temple and teaching, those who are in authority are trying to confront him and trap him and catch him so that they can embarrass him and discredit him. So what we hear in Matthew's gospel this morning is just the latest attack by another group to discredit Jesus and put him out of favor with the people. And they think that they've got the perfect scenario now. Some Pharisees and then some Herodians, who are, of course, as their name implies, allied with King Herod. Some Herodians who are in that delicate position of maintaining the political peace, being servants of Rome but having local authority. I think they've got the perfect question. Because if Jesus looks at that $20 bill and says, well, obviously you should pay the taxes because this belongs to the United States and it's not yours to begin with, the people to whom he's talking will rebel because they hate the Romans, they hate the occupation, they hate the oppression that goes along with it, and Jesus then allies himself with those who are in authority over the Jewish people. On the other hand, if he says they shouldn't pay the taxes, then he allies himself with the rebellion, and the Herodians who are charged with keeping the peace can accuse him of sedition, treason, seeking to overthrow the very delicate peace that they're trying to maintain. So as they put their heads together, the Pharisees and the Herodians came up with a perfect no-win situation for Jesus. Is it right to pay taxes? No, I'm not going to get into that question in our current context, because that wasn't really the point. The point was an attempt to trap and discredit Jesus. As you can see, it didn't work. Jesus immediately focuses in on image. He holds up the coin as I held up the $20 bill, and I said, whose image is there? This belongs, Jesus said clearly, to the emperor. It's got his face on it. So you need to give it back to him. It's his. And that kind of settles the question about taxes anyway. And Jesus could have left it there and been pretty safe. But remember that as we looked at this escalating conflict between Jesus and those in authority, we realized that he continued to tell parables and engage in this confrontation because he wants a change of mind and heart in them and in the people around who are listening to this conversation. And so it's not enough to simply answer the question, but he has to continue to bring them to their call to repentance and looking at things, especially their relationship with God, differently. So rather than simply saying, because Caesar's face is on this denarius, you need to give it back to Caesar, he says, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, simple enough, and then give to God the things that are God's. And that's where he catches them short. They're amazed, Matthew tells us, at his response. Impressed even, maybe not convinced, but amazed and impressed that he's been able to answer so skillfully. Because immediately as he said that, give to God the things that are God's, my guess is that every single one of them would have been immediately reminded of Genesis 1. Let us create humanity, God says, in our own image. And so God created humanity in God's own image. Male and female, God created them. Give to Caesar, the emperor, Jesus says, the things that are the emperor's, the things that bear the emperor's image, and give to God that which bears God's image. Namely you, Pharisees, Herodians, people of Judea, and all those listening to this conversation. Give to God what belongs to God. Namely you, all you are, and all you have. Because without God, you would have nothing at all. You would be nothing at all. You would not be. As I mentioned, the Herodians, the Pharisees were not impressed, were not changed. They walked away, no doubt surprised at what Jesus said and trying to think of a better question for next time. Stay tuned. There are more questions to come. More challenges to Jesus and his understanding of God's will for the sake of the people. But maybe this idea that we are created in the image of God is enough for us to think about and chew on for a while together. I love that story of Genesis. It's so basic. It really sets the stage for everything that follows, which is why it's in the first chapter. If you read that carefully, you notice that at the end of every one of those days of creation, God looks at what God has made and God says, it's good, it's good, it's good. Except on the sixth day, after God has created all living creatures, and then kind of the pinnacle of that creation becomes humanity, you and I. At the end of that day, there's a slightly different evaluation of creation. God looks at everything that God has made and God says it's very good. Now, we can be a little egotistical about that as human beings and say that the reason it's very good is because human beings telling the story and God loves us best of all, or maybe God's finished and that's why. But in any case, that sense that God has created humanity in God's own image, unlike anything else, is an indication that we are somehow special, set apart, different. Think about that driver's license again. I can't do anything I want with it. It doesn't give me the freedom to just drive any way I care to. I and the state of New York, like all of you who bear a driver's license and the states in which you live, have entered into an agreement together, a contract, that you will abide by the laws that pertain to operating a motor vehicle, and you will be thereby given the rights to drive. If you do not abide by those laws seriously enough, then that right to drive will be taken away. Your license will be invalid, and you will no longer be permitted to drive. Because you did not follow the rules, did not live up to the agreement, you have that right revoked. Imagine what it would be like if God worked on the same basis. As long as you're living up to my image within you, as long as you're conducting yourself as a child of God and being faithful to that in every aspect of your life, then you have every right and privilege to live. However, if you don't fulfill the terms of that agreement and follow my rules and live in harmony with my will, I therefore revoke my part of the agreement. It's been nice knowing you. God doesn't do that. And that's the miracle of grace that we depend on every day. But sometimes what happens is that we take that grace for granted. If we are created in God's image, then how much do we owe God? Everything. But God says, well, you don't have to give me everything back. Some of it is just for your enjoyment and pleasure because I love you and I want you to have a life that's fulfilling and gracious. But some must be returned, an acknowledgement that we're in relationship together, that we belong to one another, that I've created you not just for your pleasure, but my purposes, and that's why you bear that image. When the writers of the Hebrew Scriptures narrowed that down, they heard God saying, give me 10%, what has been known as the tithe. First fruits off the top. an aside here. It's mid-October. Church council met on Thursday night. We took a first crack at a budget for 2018. Should I stop now? Can you see where this is going? If every single one of us tithed our income to the church, there would be a lot less need to go see our cardiologists on the part of the church council. Because we get a little agita when October and November roll along and we look at the difference between what we're spending and how much is coming in. Now, I have to be fair, because our council president is sitting right there. He'll remind me to be fair. You guys always rise to the challenge. We get a little nervous in November, and then December comes, and the money comes in, and we are blessed and last minute make budget, usually. But it would be nice if we didn't have to stress about that, or worry if we were going to actually do it again this year. 10%? Too much? I probably mentioned to you that when Marianne and I do our taxes, the tax program assesses the different aspects of that to see if we're in danger of getting an audit. And it raises up different things on the taxes that we might want to fix or correct or just take a second look at. And almost every year it says, are you sure that you give as much as you say you give? Because you're above the national average for giving. And we, sisters and brothers, are not at 10%. But that sense that God has given us everything that we have and that we need to be generous with it, as you are in so many ways, is a reminder to us. If you don't give 10% of your income, can you give 10% of your time? If you don't give 10% of your time, can you give 10% of your heart, 10% of your attention, 10% of your ability to turn that over back to God for God's purposes, to bring grace and light and peace and hope and healing into this world? All of those things and any of those things in whatever way God has laid it on your heart to do that. And 10%, we can just forget about that, okay? Because that's just a guideline. It's just an idea if you don't know where to start or where to end up or where to go. But really, Jesus makes it quite clear in that parable that we are created in the image of God, and therefore everything we have, everything we are belongs to God. And God just says, give back. Just share. Just live into that image of that I have created you in. Or to put it in those economic terms, God is looking for a return on God's investment. Can I borrow the podium for a second? Thanks. As I was thinking about that return on the investment, our bulletin cover came to mind. This is a little different than what you've done in the past, right, Lynn? It's a different kind of an image. And I'll let you read the description in the bulletin. But so appreciative of Lynn's gifts, and a guest to our congregation mentioned how wonderful it was that we have a different bulletin cover every week created by Lynn. And that's kind of her way of giving a return on God's investment. This morning our bells played, and it was beautiful. You guys did a great job. A return on God's investment in them to use their gifts here and in other places to bring joy to people's hearts. And I'm sure that for as many of you as are here this morning, there are stories that you could tell about how you're giving God a return on God's investment in you. And the wonderful thing about God's economy is that the more we give that return, the more God blesses us and the more God gives us to give. The resources and riches of God's grace never run out. So there are hundreds of stories just in this congregation alone of how you are using your life as a return on God's investment in you. You are living into that image in which God has created you. I want to encourage you in that I want to thank God for you in that. And I want to encourage you as well to do more. To take the next step. To see other ways that your gifts can be used to bring some of God's grace into this world in which we live. Because you are created in God's image, it's up to God to work through you to bring that kingdom into reality. Finally, the challenge to the Pharisees and the Herodians is the same as God's challenge to us. Created in God's image, how will you allow that, how will you let that transform and guide you into the way that you live your life? The call always to repent, to grow more into whom God knows us to be, is the challenge of the life of faith and discipleship. You are created in God's image. You belong to God. Through you, God does wonderful things, and God can and will do more. Continue to surrender yourself so that you might live into the person that God knows and loves. Amen.